On an occasion in the past, I shared the story about how I asked Monica to marry me, how I flew her to San Francisco. And my plan was to take her on the Bay Cruise under the Golden Gate Bridge and then to Alioto's for lunch. And then eventually we'd walk over to the cable car. And on the cable car, I would get down on one knee and ask her to marry me. When I shared that story, the one thing I didn't tell you is that I was uncertain what to do with the diamond ring through that whole period. So I actually took it, put it in my front pocket, and taped it to the inside of the pocket with the hope that I wouldn't lose it. So think about that. Flying from Burbank to San Francisco with a rent-a-car, on a boat, at a restaurant. Literally the entire day, I was constantly doing this, making sure that I still had that ring. I was filled with anxiety that I was going to lose it. Obviously, I didn't lose it. She said yes, and thank the Lord she still loves me after all these years. But I share that story because metaphorically, I think that sometimes peace that's way more valuable than a diamond ring, we have the same kind of approach. It's like it's so precious to us, but we're constantly worried that we're going to lose that peace, that circumstances are going to come in or someone's going to threat it, or stress or anxiety. And subsequently, we're constantly checking, do I have peace? Do I have peace? And many times we discern, we've lost it. I don't know what happened to it. The fact of the matter is that Jesus promises that we have a different type of peace that can't be lost. Let me show you. It's going to come on the screen. It's out of John chapter 14. I want you to read this out loud with me. Let's say it together. Peace I leave with you, my peace I give you. I do not give to you as the world gives. Do not let your hearts be troubled, and do not be afraid. Brief context, John chapter 14. It's the setting, the Last Supper, the night before Jesus is crucified. By this time, the disciples have figured out that he's telling the truth, that he literally is going to die. He's going to be crucified. And he's wanting to assure them. And in this familiar passage, he begins by telling them, the peace I give you is not as the world gives you. If you're here today and you're afraid that you're going to lose your peace, or you're saying today that I don't have peace, the reality is that is a worldly type peace. Circumstances can destroy. If your peace is rooted in the world, circumstances can destroy your peace and rob you of your peace. But if your peace is centered on the person of Jesus Christ, and the promise is it passes all understanding, it can't be lost. David, though this passage actually is the place where Jesus tells them that he's sending the Holy Spirit that will indwell in them and give them an assurance of his peace, before the coming of the Holy Spirit for the body of believers, David understood that God's peace was found in the Spirit of God. And it wasn't found in circumstances and situations. We're going to understand better the context of Psalm 37, and I want you to see how relevant it is to every single one of us. We're going to study verses 1 through 11, but I want to begin by reading verses 1 through 6. As I read, I want you to notice some assertions that David is making that will allude to the assurance that no matter what circumstances are, you and I can have peace. Would you help me honor the Lord by standing and follow as I read Psalm 37, verses 1 through 6. David wrote, "Do not fret because of those who are evil, or be envious of those who do wrong. For like the grass, they will soon wither. Like green plants, they will soon die away. Trust in the Lord and do good. Dwell in the land and enjoy safe pastures. Take delight in the Lord, and he will give you the desires of your heart. Commit your way to the Lord. Trust in him, and he will do this. He will make your righteous reward shine like the dawn, your vindication like the noonday sun." Thank you. May be seated. As always, context is critical. What was actually going on in David's life when he penned this psalm? Most of you know that David became the king of Israel. When he wrote this psalm, that had not happened. He'd been anointed, but King Saul was still in power. And by this time, he had already conquered Goliath. He was already brought into the palace. He had married one of Saul's daughters. He was now leading Saul's armies. But Saul began to distrust David And as we'll see in the first point, became envious of him. And most of you are familiar, he put a death threat on David's life. And when David pins his psalm, he's literally on the run. I have to wonder that when he wrote this down, he wasn't thinking, this psalm will survive the ages, and in 2025, a group of people will study it. I think that David penned this psalm as a journal to say, this is what I need to remind myself of in the precarious situation that I find myself in so that I don't lose my peace. And from that, you will find that it's relevant to every single one of us. This week, as I began to prepare this message, and I started praying for our church family, and specifically even for many of you, I was acutely aware of how peace can be so elusive. Some of you are in some really difficult situations. There are serious conflicts in your family, not because of anything that you've done, but because of perceptions of other people. Some of you are struggling with health issues, and it's a challenge for you to get up and even be here. Others, financial. There are countless reasons why the majority of you should not have peace. But it's my prayer and my longing that because you are a child of God and you put your faith in him, that what we talk about today, you will look and say, that belongs to me. I experience this every single day. So how do we do that? How do we know when peace is present? Here's the first thing we're going to learn, is that peace is present when we refuse to worry. Worry will erode your peace. Some of us are naturally gifted worriers, and that plays into the challenge of having peace. But David provides some tangible solutions how you and I can avoid worrying, or as he frames it, fretting. Look again at verse 1. Do not fret because of those who are evil, or be envious of those who do wrong. Pause right there. I've already given you the context that wicked King Saul is trying to take his life. David has tangible reasons to be upset, concerned, and worry. He's not making these things up. It's a well-known fact that there's a death threat on his life. And yet, he has a confidence and a certainty. I want to give you a little bit more context of how did this whole narrative begin. As it comes on the screen, I want you to follow along as I read from 1 Samuel of how this started that gives evidence that David was not making this up. So David had just come back from a great battle. They're celebrating as he comes back into the city. And as recorded, as they danced, they sang, Saul has slain his thousands and David his tens of thousands. Saul was very angry. This refrain galled him. They have credited David with tens of thousands, he thought, but me only thousands. What more can he get at but the kingdom? And from that time on, Saul kept a jealous eye on David. David didn't do anything wrong. He did exactly what he was told to do. Go to war, win the battle, exalt the name of God, and move Israel forward. And yet Saul, in his own insecurity and jealousy, plots a death threat on David. That's some of your situations. Some of your situations are individuals that are your opponents who their hearts are not right with God. And whether out of jealousy, envy, insecurity, you can go down the list, they are slandering your name. At different times, maybe your situation is not as extreme, but at different times, all of us have had somebody say something about us that maligned our character, and we can intimately understand the feelings that David is having. And yet he comes back to this assertion in verse 1, you and I should not fret or worry about those kinds of people. The metaphorical King Sauls in our lives are not really our problem. Look what he goes on to say. Here's the justification for it. Rereading verse 1, looking at verse 2. Do not fret because of those who are evil, or be envious of those who do wrong. For like the grass, they will soon wither. Like green plants, they will soon die away. David had lived long enough to know that the path of the evildoer is slippery. They may have a certain season of success, but it's not sustainable. That's just a fact or a reality of life. but then you add the confidence, the assurance of the justice of God. We spent the last 3 months walking through 4 minor prophets with a consistent theme that God is just, that he will address evildoers. For those perpetrators who come against you that are doing evil deeds, maligning your name, God says, I will oppose the proud and I will give grace to the humble. And David's theology was so well founded that he had no concerns. There were no uncertainties in his life whether this was true. So when here's Saul slandering his name to the entire nation, David knows that God has it. And that's what I want you to know, that the nature of your God is the assurance that you don't have to worry. As we consider what's being offered to us, look then at this action point as it comes on the screen. And then let's look at the next 2 verses. Rather than worrying, we need to make a choice to do good. Many times when we sit and worry and ruminate over our problems or situations, they grow in their intensity, not in their reality. And so David understands that of our human nature, and he provides the solution. Still with me, we just looked at verse 2. Look at verse 3. Trust in the Lord and do good, dwell in the land and enjoy safe pastures. He gives 3 specific actions: do good, dwell in the land, and enjoy safe pastures. Let's seek to understand exactly what he's telling us to do. He starts with the word trust. Betah is the Hebrew word. And I mention that because it has a range of understanding and application. It doesn't just mean trust, it means security. It has an idea of confidence. It gives a sense of expectation because the direct object is God. Trust in God, betah. And he's helping us to see that we're not trusting in some sort of entity that we can't actually believe in, but in the very nature of our God, who is consistent, and we can rely upon him to continually do these particular things because it's birthed out of his nature. And so as David points to that, he says, when we do good, because we're trusting in God, betah, good, we're going to understand a little bit more what good is, but some of the implications that we will dwell in the land and enjoy safe pastures. Now, in order for us to really see how this applies to our life, we have to then grasp the cultural context. And most of you know that David started out as a shepherd. So he's picking up on these metaphors that's related to his own journey. For example, we know that he had testified when he was called into battle that he didn't need the armor of Saul because he had already killed a lion and a bear. Think about that. We know that sheep are pretty dumb animals, but if they are out in the open, they are mindful of threats. But David is saying that sheep that have a good shepherd that protect them and watch over them, they don't have to run. They don't have to leave the territory, the land. They can actually dwell in safe pastures. The idea is this open meadow where they're sitting ducks, if you will, but they're not concerned. They're enjoying the safety and the grazing because they have a shepherd that's constantly looking out for the bears and the lions. How does that apply to you? It applies to you is that David is ultimately stating that our God is that good shepherd, that he is mindful of the bears and lions that threaten your well-being. He knows them better than you do. And he knows how to deal with them and handle them. And because he cares about you, his sheep, the sheep of his pastures, he promises that this is what he will do. This is his nature in regards to loving his creation. And so it's out of that we can do good. Look then at verse 4. He goes on to say, take delight in the Lord, and he will give you the desires of your heart. Take delight in the Lord, and he will give you the desires of your heart. What does it mean to delight? I want you to think of a contrast between delight and deliberate. Delight and deliberate. What do I mean by that? That when we worry, we deliberate. We begin to contemplate. We strategize. If David had given in to worry or fretting, he would be sitting all day long trying to anticipate what Saul's strategy was. What do I do? Where do I go? How do I protect myself? Who do I talk to? Who do I know is in my camp and who is in Saul's camp? And he would be overwhelmed by fear and handicapped from that. But he says, I'm going to avoid that. I'm not going to deliberate. I'm going to delight in God. So what does it mean to delight? For you and I to delight in God. I'll give you an example. So I was out in Texas last week for Thanksgiving, and my daughter-in-law's mom is Dawn. Dawn is from Southern California, and she moved out to be with her daughter and grandkids. She is a major Dodger fan, like major. And so I hadn't talked to Dawn since the Dodgers had won the World Series. And I knew that the first thing when I saw her that I needed to find out, wow, what was that experience like for you? And so I said, Dawn, congratulations, your Dodgers won the World Series. And she just like lit up. And I said, what did you think about Ramirez hitting that home run in the ninth? And she goes, no, it was Diaz. Oh, right, yeah. And then I went on to ask her a couple more questions. Like everybody's talking about that, but what about the home run, the 11th by Will Smith? And for the next 10 minutes, she walked me through, though it had been an entire month, she walked me through every play of the last few innings. She delights in the Dodgers. So when someone asks you about your God, do you light up like that? When someone says, so I notice you go to church. I see you carrying a Bible. What's that all about? He's like, can I just tell you? Can I let you know the greatness of my God and what he's done for me? Oh, no, we're so tactful. We're so sophisticated. We can talk about our sports teams like that, but when it comes to our God, it's like, let's kind of keep it subdued. David says that whether publicly or privately, you and I should delight in the goodness and the greatness of our God and how he loves us and cares for us and watches over us. And when we do, we won't spend time deliberating of what our enemy is doing, what we're worrying about. I want you to then write down a couple of different things. Please write down the first word, believe. And I apologize I didn't get this in the PowerPoint, but bear with me. I want you to take this kind of abstract and live this out. So as you write down the word believe, there's 3 words I want you to write with it. Favor, fortify, and fair. Favor, fortify, and fair. Part of the way that you can begin to grow in this aspect of delighting is have some focus when it comes to reflecting on God's goodness. So coming back to that first aspect of believe, take time in your quiet time, believe that God has shown you favor. Now, some of you are thinking, I kind of get that. And others like, Bruce, you must be talking about somebody else. You don't know my background. You don't know my family. God has not really shown me favor. Let me, if any of you are having that thought, let me press against that for a moment. If you're here today and you put your faith in Jesus Christ and your name is written on his book of life, I would argue God showed you favor. And if you even had the recognition that you had that need, it was only by God's grace that you came to the awareness that you're a sinner and you needed a Savior, and his name was Jesus Christ. I would argue again, that's another aspect of God's favor. And if you're here today and you've not done that, let me just say that your invitation to be in this service or watching online is another example of God's favor, because I would say to you that you need to stop right where you're at, acknowledge the goodness and the greatness of God, confess your sins, and invite him into your life so that you too can know that your name is written on his book of life. God shows us favor every day. Every day. How much do we actually delight in the fact that God has shown us favor over and over again? And then think about fortifying, that he protects us. He watches over us. Some of you are like, well, again, you don't really know my life. I would say that just the fact that every day we have breath speaks about God's protection. The fact that even in a pragmatic sense that we have medicine and science. Think about how God has offered that kind of intelligence and advancement that has given us opportunities for healthiness. In spite of the healthcare system that we may have issues with, the fact of the matter is that any one of us can go to a doctor and be diagnosed of an illness that we may have with a prescribed treatment. That isn't the birth of science and the intelligence of man. It is God's protection over us and his constant care. And then going back to the idea of fair, that God is fair. Do you realize that if you are looking at others and saying, I don't have what they have. I mean, if I really felt God was good to me, then I would have those things. I come back to what we watched as we went through the minor prophets, is that in God's fairness, he knows what you and I can handle. Like a good parent, he grasps what is best for us. And he provides those things in a pace and a manner in which we can grow and develop and steward them well. This is just one of many ways that God has shown fairness to us. And I would go so far as that his fairness is rooted in his mercy because he's not given us what we actually deserve. These are just a few things that I want to challenge you when it comes to this idea of delighting in God that can counter your worries. These are doing good. This is what it looks like to dwell in safe pastures. And as that begins to happen, our confidence in God's care, his love, and his involvement grows, which brings to the second thing. Another thing that can erode our peace is retaliation. When we have the presence of peace, we will resist retaliating when we've been hurt or injured. Look at verse 5. Commit your way to the Lord, trust in him, and he will do this. Stop right there for a moment. Commit your way. Derek is the word for way. It also is translated road or path. We could easily understand that when David uses that, is that God has fashioned a path or a road that we're to follow, and retaliation is not a part of it. David knew that vengeance is mine, saith the Lord. David understood that if he took the opportunity to take revenge on Saul or his family or any others, that he was leaving the path, the road that God had given him. And that's absolutely true for all of us. We're to stay on the path, which is then defined by God's will, the boundaries, and what his law actually offers us and instructs us to do. Now, as I share that, I come back to this idea of what David is actually experiencing. He's been maligned. He's been slandered. His life has been threatened. One of the things that David is dealing with is the injustice of the matter. And many times, our longing for revenge has a lot to do with justice. Bear with me. I would go so far to say that every single one of us in the room at one time or another has been insulted or injured. It could be in significant ways where it's cost us our job, or it's broken a relationship, or it could be in minor ways where we're just in a tiff with our spouse or in the household and we're not getting along with our roommates, whatever it might be. The fact of the matter is that any time that we have suffered an injustice, there is a part of us that longs for justice to be fulfilled, especially if it's been more severe. And when we look at this longing for justice, it many times leads us to the conclusion that I need to take responsibility to address this. And I've heard this more than once where individuals say, well, if I don't do that, this person's going to go on hurting and injuring others. Now, there are some places where we need to confront that, but that never gives us permission, authority to actually take revenge and exercise justice ourselves. And I would argue that longing is because we have been created in the image of God, and God's image is just. So how David is framing this is that though he has legitimate reason to want justice, he's looking to his God to be the one that can actually execute justice in a way that's equitable and fair. And that's important. Theologically, that's important for us to understand so that we don't ultimately give in to that temptation. As I share that, I recognize that initially when you hear that, the majority of you are probably thinking, well, I'm not that kind of person, Bruce. I'm not the kind of person that's going to seek revenge. I'm not going to punch anybody in the nose or run them off the road. I'm just not. But I would argue that there are ways that all of us have retaliated and perhaps didn't even know. Let me give you an illustration to make that point. Have you ever left the house and been a few blocks away and started thinking, I don't think I took care of that. I didn't lock the door. Or I left the dog out in the garage, or I didn't close the refrigerator, I didn't turn the coffee pot. Have you ever had that experience? It happens to me all the time. It happened about 2 weeks ago. Our dog has not been eating, and so that morning I realized there was still food in her bowl, and I thought, I need to make some rice for her. So before I went out the door, I quickly made some rice, let it cool off, and I shoveled it into her bowl, and then I raced out the door. I was about 5 blocks away, and I started thinking, I don't know if I actually turned off the stove and the burner. And Monica and I both are going to be gone all day long. And I started thinking about the stove and the burner going all day long. And I realized that if I turned around and went back, that I was going to be late for my meeting. And I was relieved because I remembered that my mother-in-law was going to come by and check on Kona. So I pulled over, I texted Mom, and I said, hey, can you do me a favor? I was so busy, my mind wasn't on things, and I don't know if I left the stove on. Would you check for me? And thankfully it was. Why do I say that? Because there are many things that we do unconsciously. We're not actually thinking and considering, and I would argue retaliation. There are many times when we've been hurt. Here's the premise of what I'm saying. If you've been hurt and you not addressed that hurt, you've just dismissed it, you've been busy, your mind is on something else, that hurt resides in your heart. And sooner or later, it begins to surface itself in retaliation. And many times retaliation comes through the form of a silent treatment. Sometimes you do that intentionally. Sometimes you do that just because you're hurt. That person has said something to you, you get a text from them, you see it, and you're like, I don't have time for that right now. You're not intentionally saying, I'm going to let them pay for what they said and did to me, and then I'm going to let them sit on this text. That's not your consciousness. But the fact of the matter is, you have willfully chosen not to respond immediately because down inside there's an injury. It happens oftentimes in certain annoying behaviors. That's a little bit more intentional, but sometimes it's not like I'm going to pay you back. I'm going to then leave that milk carton in the refrigerator empty because that'll really make you annoyed. Or I'm going to leave the toilet seat up again because I know that's going to bother you. But we oftentimes don't take others in consideration. We do things that are annoying to them because down inside we're a little bit hurt. We're a little bit peeved about the way that we treated them. And I mention that so that we actually deal with the hurt and the injury so that we don't find ourselves falling into that pattern or that trap. Look again here at verse 6. Here's why David said we can do this. We can stay on this path. He will make your righteous reward shine like the dawn, your vindication like the noonday sun. There are many things that we could unpack from this, but I just want to offer you two. If you're in a situation where you have been slandered, someone has said something about you that's incorrect, unfair, and unjust, one of the reasons you can resist the temptation to take revenge is that God knows your heart, and he has promised, he said that to David, that he will bring out the truth and he will bring the evidence. You don't have to be constantly bearing the argument of defense, the evidence to show your innocence. But here's the second thing I want to say, is that that's absolutely true when your heart is right and you haven't done that. But it also is true if you've sinned. Now you say, well, what are you talking about? I've watched this over and over in relationships and particularly in marriage, where a spouse has actually done something that has eroded trust. And there's reasons for that other spouse not to trust them. But they are now on a path of repentance and righteousness. And I watch over and over that spouse then has their own measurement of what they've done that determines their value of success and trust. In other words, in their mind, hey, I haven't looked at porn in 2 months. You should trust me. If that's your issue, guys or gals, I just want to say to you, if you think that your own righteousness will then ultimately deter your sin from the past and will ultimately allow trust to come back in your relationship, you're deceiving yourselves. God knows your heart, and he knows whether you're going to stay on that path of repentance. And when he's ready, he will reveal your righteous heart to your spouse. But I'm just telling you that it doesn't matter. I use that one example. But if you've done something to injure your spouse that has eroded trust, and now you're trying to correct that with the assumption that you're going to get right back to where you think you should be, apart from what God is doing, you're deceiving yourselves. Stay on the path that God has given you and let God determine and show where your heart is and help to restore that trust. So as we think about what God has promised to do for us, how do we go about doing that? Choose to be patient. This is absolutely relevant. Choose to be patient. If you write that down, I want to then direct your attention to the next verse, verse 7. This was certainly relevant in David's life. We don't know how long, but it had to have been at least months, if not over a year, that he's on the run. So he writes this down. He says, be still before the Lord and wait patiently for him. Do not fret when people succeed in their ways. He's still drilling home that Saul has not been held accountable. So don't fret. Keep being patient. Trust him. And he goes on to say, when they carry out their wicked schemes. He's saying that when we see people who are oppositional and antagonistic towards us, and we don't see God immediately acting, it's easy for us to get impatient and we want to go back to revenge. But he says if we're going to actually believe and see that God's going to come through, we have to be still. Still is the Hebrew word dam, and it actually means silent. If I were to read that from a literal sense, it says, sit silently before the Lord, exercising patience. Think about that. Sit silently before the Lord, exercising patience. I want you to write down a few more words before we head to our third point and head towards the end. Here's the first word I want you to write down, confess, confess. And then the couple of words adjacent to that, I want you to write down disappointment and desire. Confess, disappointment, desire. Let me give you an example that I've experienced how this relates. I'm sure all of you have had a certain time or place where there's been a perception or maybe evidence that someone is talking behind your back. Could be a family member, could be a coworker, could be someone at church, could be a variety of different things. What do you do with that? It's not accurate, it's not certain, it's kind of elusive. In those situations I find myself in, I become very anxious. This passage is so relevant because I start thinking about, is it true? What might they be saying? How will that affect the community, whatever the community might be? And then I'm strategizing. I'm thinking, how do I confront that? How do I address it? What do I do? And I can get so worked up about it. And many times it's not even accurate. But nonetheless, it's a threat. So coming back to this idea of disappointment, being still and sitting in silence with the Lord, is that it's healthy and appropriate to begin to express that to the Lord, especially when you don't have a specific path of action that he's given you. So in my case, and this has happened recently, I just sat with the Lord and I started pouring out my heart. I said, God, I don't know if this is true or not, but my heart is heavy. I keep thinking about it. I feel a certain level of anxiety. I'm worried what might be said, if it's true, if people are believing it's true, yada, yada, yada. And as I continue to pray, I really sense what we're looking at today, that God's interest and concern was there, available and present. And from that, then as we give adequate space to talk about our hurt, we express it to the Lord rather than sharing it to our best friend. We begin to describe its implications. We acknowledge our fear, our worries, and our anxiety in it. Then we move to talking about our desires. Then we say, if he's promised to give you the desires of your heart, the context is related to this aspect of confrontation. What is our desire? In my particular case, as I was processing this, it was, Father, if there is something that I've done, please let me know. If this is a break in a relationship, then give them the courage to come forward so that we can talk together and resolve it. If this is causing disunity, then help that to be resolved, protect that. And when we do that, the peace that passes all understanding comes back to us. We have now taken an action that's going to diminish our worry and replace it with confidence and trust in the Lord. So as we understand what it looks like to be patient, here's the third thing we need to know, where when peace is present, this will be an action that we will take. We will refrain from anger. And if you're paying attention, there is a progression. Worry leads to a tendency to want to retaliate. And as we think about how we're going to retaliate, it moves to anger. So watch how David then expresses this in his own journey. And now in verse 8, he says, refrain from anger and turn from wrath. Do not fret. Have you noticed how many times in this passage he says, don't fret or worry? Refrain from anger and turn from wrath. Do not fret. It only leads to evil. Stop for a moment. Essentially what he's saying, the progression is that if you and I begin to worry, especially when it comes to a relationship, that begins to move to this area of fretting. And as we fret more and more, we become angry. And if we act in our anger, we then are acting in an evil way. That's the whole idea of the retaliation rather than letting the Lord do that. So he is warning us against that. I want to give you one passage to write down. I'm not going to try to unpack it so that you can see how it applies, and then we'll move to the action for it. It's a passage in 1 Samuel chapter 24, verses really down, it's verses 3 through 13. I'm going to read verses 12 to 13 of it. Here's the brief context. So after a number of months, David being on the run, he and his soldiers are hiding out in a cave, and Saul, who's seeking him, wanders in ignorantly to this cave by himself. And at some point, evidently, he falls asleep. And so David has the opportunity to seize that and take Saul's life, to end this whole insanity. And that's exactly what his soldiers want him to do. But instead, what he does is he cuts off a part of his garment. And then I want you to see what he says to Saul after Saul wakes up and leaves the cave. He shouts out to him this. He says, "May the Lord judge between you and me, and may the Lord avenge the wrongs you have done to me, but my hand will not touch you. As the old saying goes, from evildoers come evil deeds, so my hand will not touch you." There's a number of things related to what we've just seen in the psalm that's related to that. First and foremost, he is coming back to the idea that God is the just judge, and I will trust the Lord. In the passage, you'll see that he's still acknowledging, though Saul is a terrible king, he's God's anointed king. And it's not his business to take that king out. It's God's business. God's the sovereign one. And so that comes to aspects of authority. You can confront authority, but at the end of the day, God's job is to deal with the authorities that are not behaving in ways that are honoring to the Lord. But not just that, is that as he makes that statement, he is stating the fact that if I give into this, I'm just like you. And many times when we make that little comment, we're sarcastic, we fire back at someone because they've hurt our feelings or we feel that they're treating us unjustly, we're behaving the same way. We're actually not elevating righteousness and bringing God's presence into the situation. We're dealing it in our own flesh, and it never turns out well. In marriages, this is the thing that escalates the conflict because someone is not willing to be humble enough and trust God to say, you have to deal with that injury and that hurt that my spouse has given me. And it applies in every relationship. David understood that. Watch then one more time, verse 8, and I want to read verse 9. "Refrain from your anger and turn from your wrath. Do not fret. It leads only to evil. For those who are evil will be destroyed, but those who hope in the Lord will inherit the land." Would you please write that action down? If all of this is true, then you and I should have an intensified hope no matter what our situation and circumstance is. Hope and peace are joined together. And it's not coincidental that David starts with that exhortation in verse 1, and as he comes to verse 9, he repeats the exact same exhortation about the state and the condition of evildoers, wanting us to have a confidence that we can put our hope in God. Therefore, the take-home truth is simply this: peace is present when we reject unbelief. If we do not accept and behave in a manner that reflects the truthfulness of what we've looked at, we have fallen in unbelief. And if we're in unbelief, then our problem is perpetuated. Let me close by reading verses 10 and 11. "In a little while, the wicked will be no more. Though you look for them, they will not be found." See if verse 11 sounds familiar to you. "But the meek will inherit the land and enjoy peace and prosperity." The meek will inherit the land. Remember the Beatitudes? What did Jesus say? "Blessed are the meek, for they shall inherit the earth." That's where it comes from. Jesus is quoting as he's seen David make this statement, that that's true for us, that there is a hope and inheritance for us when we stay on that path. I want to finish with this story, and we'll go to communion. So as I referenced, we were out in Texas. We had a great time with our kids and our grandkids. And one day I was over at my son's house, and his little boy Knox, who's 30 months old, has a Strider bike. Do you know what a Strider bike is? They're little bikes for toddlers that don't actually have pedals, but you can coast on them, and they have movement with their feet. And so he's kind of a crazy guy, and a lot of action. And so my son actually bought some ramps for him. And he goes up the ramp, and he goes across, and he goes down, and he has them set up on the sidewalk. And so we were out there watching Knox one day, and it had probably been 20, 25 minutes going back and forth. But typical of a child, he wants to be seen. So at one point, he shot down the ramp, and he looked over his shoulder to see if Papa and Dad were watching. And when he did, he went off the sidewalk, and his front wheel went into the gutter there, and bam, he went down. And it was interesting to me because you know those moments when you're around little kids and you're just waiting? It's going to be a blood-curdling scream and they're going to lose it, or it's going to be a whimper. You just don't know. But it was so interesting because Knox looked back at his father, laying flat on the ground, face down on the sidewalk, and he looks back at his father as if to say, "Am I okay?" And Tyler said, "Knox, you're good. Get up, buddy. You're fine. And bam, he popped right up and went right back. I share that story is that when we've been knocked down, that should be our first response. Our first response shouldn't be panic. It shouldn't be fear. It shouldn't be worry. Our first response should be looking to our Father and saying, you got this. Am I all right? And he will give you the assurance and the guidance and direction to do that. I want to finish with this one verse. Cardi, you have that one for me, bud? Peter said this very same thing. He summarized the whole thing in this one simple statement. Cast all your anxiety on him because he cares for you.